Okay, hi. Obviously, Chiara was going to be chairing the whole thing. All I'm going to do now is give you just a rundown on what our lab is all about. Chiara and I both teach in a translation and interpreting department, where the focus is very much on ESP and obviously technical languages, from legal text, medical texts, computer text, and so on. And most invited guests tend to talk in that kind of direction. So we set up a lab that would focus on public spaces in the media. So we looked at everything from newspapers, TV, and nowadays, of course, social media, because we were particularly interested in things that were happening or about to happen in the future. And I'm very proud to say that over the past, what is it, Chiara, 10 years or so that we've been setting up these labs, the kind of people we've invited, like your good selves this morning, have always been very much ahead of what was about to happen again and again. Even last week, where talking about the invisibility of translation, the three speakers were talking about newspaper and TV texts regarding walls and migration and very up-to-date topics, as I'm sure you're going to talk about up-to-date topics this morning. We think it's useful to translators too, because translation isn't just about words on a page, it's also about words that are attached to polysemiotic features, such as visuals and sounds, which are not necessarily always verbal. Yeah, that's all I've got to say. Last year, to give you an idea of the kind of things we did, last year we had the translators of Game of Thrones, and we had Luca Barra, who's there somewhere in the chat, talking about the impact of Game of Thrones in Italy. And we had somebody who's Loredana Polezzi, who's now at Stony Brook in the States, talking about Raffaella Carrà and how she brought African American texts to Italy. And yesterday's Guardian, there's a whole article on Raffaella Carrà and how she brought these kind of texts to Italy. So Chiara and I and our speakers are always ahead of the game. Over to you, Chiara.
Thank you very much, Delia. Thank you everyone for being here. I think I'll keep this short because I'm really scared that it's going to drop. But anyway, I just wanted to actually confirm what Delia was saying, the fact that with these lecture series, we're trying to basically foster interdisciplinary approaches. It's really good to from people from adjacent fields, of course. I think this, the lineup today is actually reflects what we're trying to do, because we have a mixture of media scholars. I think Kathryn Johnson and Paul Grainge would mainly identify as media scholars, and maybe Kathryn, I think you wouldn't mind me saying that you're mainly a translation and literary scholar. So this is reflected, our purpose is really reflected in the lineup that we have here today. I don't think I need to go over what paratexts are. If you're here as part of the audience, I think you have a pretty good idea what they are. Also, it's sort of a thorny issue, so I don't really want to go into that, and maybe some of our guest speakers are going to go into that or plan to say something on what qualifies as paratext or paratextual material, but there's a little bit of a debate there, given the fact that the media landscape is so fluid today. So you have constant additions and transformations to what can qualify as paratext. But in general, obviously, paratext, we mean paratext as texts that help us in the understanding, giving us access, understanding, in helping our interpretation and also our enjoyment of media text. In general, and I think it's also, it will be very apparent how this connects to translation studies as well, to issues of concerning translation, adaptation, localization, and linguistic and cultural mediation as well. And I think more specifically, Kathryn Batchelor is going to talk about, I think her talk is going to be about how under-researched this field of paratext is in audiovisual translation itself. So I think there's going to be a lot of connections between fields, disciplinary fields. So I think I'll just shut up for now. You're not here to hear me. I'll just remind you that we'll have a 15-minute talks by each of our speakers, and this will be followed by Q&A session. So to the audience, please keep your mics and webcams off during the talks. Obviously, if you're not a speaker or organizer, you can post your questions in the chat. We'll collect them for our speakers to answer at the end. And also the event, just so you know, is being recorded. Okay, so I think we'll start with Kathryn Johnson for our first talk. Kathryn is a professor of media and communications at the Center for Participatory Culture at the University of Huddersfield in the UK. She has a number of books, of course, the most recent of which is Online Television, I think published last year, 2019. And I'm sure she's going to be talking about some of the issues that she addresses in the book in her talk today, I assume. Okay, which is going to be about the apps, devices, and platforms and discoverability. So over to you, Kathryn.
Thank you so much, Chiara. I hope everyone can hear me. Wave at me if you can't. And also to Chiara and Delia and Jennifer for the invitation. It's really great to be here today. The talk that I'm going to give is based on an article that I published this summer in Critical Studies in Television about a specific, but I'm going to argue quite important kind of media paratext that has been largely overlooked, and that is TV apps. And we might have an interesting discussion about what kind of paratext they are and how they count as paratext, but I'll talk a little bit about that over the talk. There's almost no academic work on TV apps within TV and media studies. So when I finished online TV and I started thinking about some of the changes to the landscape, I looked across all of the sort of major books and journals that were publishing around internet distributed television, and I found that apps was pretty much absent from that discussion, including in my own book. I mean, it doesn't even appear as an index term in my own book, Online TV. And then I had to look at the work on apps themselves, so not specifically TV apps. And again, there's a focus almost exclusively on mobile applications, and there's almost no work looking specifically at television and the sort of apps in television. So this got me thinking about apps, and so what I want to do today is to share some of my thinking about why TV apps might be an important part of the media landscape that should be on our agenda. And I'm going to argue two things. I'm going to argue that apps play an increasingly important role in framing how we access and therefore how we experience television. So I'm going to be arguing that we can think of apps as what Jonathan Gray terms entryway paratexts. So these are the kind of paratexts that determine and control entrance into a text. So I'm going to argue that TV apps do that in quite important ways, as we'll go on to say. In fact, I think we could even go further and argue that they could be seen as determining and controlling our wider experience of and access to television more generally. So following on from that, my second argument will be that the rise of TV apps makes questions of discoverability increasingly important to the television landscape. So why TV apps? Why have TV apps become an important paratext that I'm arguing we need to be thinking about? I mean, it's driven really by a rise of on-demand viewing, and in particular, the rise of TV viewing on smart TVs, connected devices, and mobile devices. All of these devices use apps as a way television. So rather than turning on the television and going straight into a linear channel that you can then flick through a number of different channels, or straight into an electronic program guide, as might have been common in a sort of a satellite or digital context, increasingly when we turn on a smart television or a connected device like a Roku or Amazon Fire TV stick, or we go onto a tablet or a mobile device, we are going into television through an app, or we are experiencing sort of a sea of apps, an array of apps. So as on-demand viewing through smart TVs, connected devices and mobiles becomes a more commonplace way of viewing television, TV apps emerge as a more important and everyday way of accessing TV. So what are apps? Apps are a particular kind of software, and they are especially associated with the emergence of the iPhone, but are now a common way to deliver software on the devices I've been talking about: mobile devices, smart TVs, and connected devices. Without getting too technical, I want to highlight 3 core characteristics of apps as a form of software that are helpful for us to understand what changes when TV starts to be delivered via apps. So the first characteristic of apps is that they tend to be used for specific activities. So we go to apps to do a specific thing. And this means that apps tend to silo or contain us within their space to do a particular thing, a particular activity that has been programmed by the app. So if you think about your mobile phone, you go into one app to message somebody, another app to watch TV programs, another app to play games, another app to time your talk while you're giving a conference paper. So different apps do different things, and when you're in those apps, the things that you can do are programmed for you by the software. The second characteristic of apps is that it's not automatically possible or easy to search within and across different apps. So here it's useful to think about the difference between, say, a desktop and a smartphone. So if you think about your desktop, you can search within all of the files in your desktops to find things. If you think about your mobile phone, it's not necessarily easy or straightforward. You can't just search within all of the apps in your mobile phone to find something. So that's a function of the different kinds of software that are working there. And the third characteristic of apps is that app controllers own the data that we generate within apps. So everything that we do within the app is turned into data that can be that is owned and can be analysed and utilised by the app owner. So to understand the paratextual function of TV apps, I argue that we can think about 3 different kinds of TV app. So the first is probably what comes into your mind when you think of the term TV apps, and that's what I'm referring to as content apps. So this is the likes of Netflix, RaiPlay, BBC iPlayer. So these content apps provide access to a database of content that has been acquired or commissioned directly by the app. And what we do in those apps is we encounter a catalogue of content that we then watch, and they're oriented towards offering us that catalogue of content and providing viewing experience. The second kind of app is less common. You may or may not have encountered them. I hadn't until I started researching this area, is what I'm terming discovery apps. And these are apps that solve that problem that I was talking about earlier about not being able to search across different apps. So they enable search and filtering of the catalogues of content apps. So an example of this is an app called Just Watch, which is also available in Italy. I checked, it's available in 22 countries. And Just Watch allows you to search within catalogues of certain content apps that it has negotiated access to. And so what you can do is you can go into Just Watch, you can search for a particular program and it'll tell you which content apps it's available in. It also shows you content by genre or by popularity, or according to things that you have saved into your watch list before, so things it thinks you'll like. And then the third kind of app is what I'm terming aggregator apps, and these combine the function of content apps and discovery apps. So examples of aggregator apps would be something like Sky Italia's Sky Q or Amazon Prime Video. So what aggregator apps do is that they provide access to a database of content that's been acquired or commissioned directly by the app. So the content that Amazon has acquired and produced, or the content that Sky has produced for Sky Q. But it also allows the user to search within certain other apps. So within Sky Q, you can search within Netflix, and it will also foreground recommendations both from Sky's content and that it's commissioned in its own channels, but also from within Netflix. Similarly, on Prime Video, if you search for sport, for example, you'll see lots of content from Eurosports Player, which is a separate app that that Amazon is allowed to sort of search within and surface content from. So aggregator apps are fulfilling kind of the functions of both a content app and a discovery app. So one of the things that becomes immediately apparent when you start looking at the different kinds of apps and thinking about television in this world of apps is that discoverability becomes more of an issue because it isn't possible to search easily across different apps. You don't know what's in an app until you go into it. So how do you know what's available where and how do you find things? So this issue of discoverability has come to the prominence. And discovery and aggregator apps have emerged as a way of dealing with the problem of content being siloed within apps. But discovery apps are relatively niche and have been set up largely by digital startups. I would argue that aggregator apps are a much more significant intervention because they're being produced by major players within the market. These are companies who are not only content providers, but they're also technology providers with dominant market positions. So if you think about Sky and its dominant market position in the world of pay TV and internet service provision, or Amazon in its dominant position in the world of online retail. So given their dominant market position, aggregator apps have the potential to act as significant gatekeepers to content. They can determine what content is recommended, what content appears in search results, and what apps are available or preloaded. So if we think about this idea of apps as entryway paratexts, aggregator apps have particular gatekeeper sort of status in this context. But aggregator apps are not the only gatekeepers in the world of TV apps. Device manufacturers also play an important gatekeeper role, and the role of TV set manufacturers is one of the things that is specific to the world of TV apps. So like aggregator apps, device manufacturers can determine what content is recommended or appears in search results. It can determine which apps are preloaded or not preloaded. In addition, device manufacturers can provide shortcuts on remotes to certain apps so that they become more accessible. And of course, certain companies like Amazon are both providers of aggregator apps through Amazon Prime Video and also devices, so Amazon Fire TV Stick. So the gatekeeper functions that aggregator apps and devices play are subject to commercial negotiations. And this is what a recent review of TV user interfaces in the UK market referred to as an economics of prominence. So content providers and content apps can pay to be preloaded. They can pay to have their programs promoted in recommendation and search results. So when you search for a particular term, their programs come top, and they can pay to have that shortcut put on their remote control. And it should come as no surprise to hear that the major global content apps have more leverage in this market than national or niche apps because they're able to make deals at international levels and because device manufacturers in particular want to limit nation by nation changes. So it's no surprise that you probably have a Netflix button on your remote and you probably don't have a RaiPlay button on your remote. National apps are not totally without leverage, however. At the moment, most audiences expect major national content apps to be available and visible on devices and within aggregator apps. So the argument that's put forward by those device manufacturers and aggregator apps is, well, people want to see the national apps anyway, so we're never going to push those national apps low down. But of course, this is not guaranteed, and it can be problematic for niche apps and for smaller public service broadcasters, like, for example, the Welsh language public service broadcaster S4C in the UK context that has a relatively small audience. Another important issue in these commercial negotiations is around access to data. I mentioned earlier that app owners can gather detailed and proprietary data about their users, and this data can provide economic advantage. In making deals that allow devices or aggregator apps to search within content apps or surface their programs in search results, content apps are often required to cede control over their proprietary data to devices and aggregator apps. For example, if you wanted to appear in a sort of line of what are the most popular programs, you would need to provide access to your viewer data within your app. So this is another way in which devices and aggregator apps can exert control in the market and gain access to valuable user data. They don't have to give their data away to the smaller national content apps, but they can get access to the data of those apps. A final point worth mentioning here relates to voice search. So voice search is not only affected by the economics of prominence, where content providers can pay for their content to be promoted in voice searches, but also by the economics of making languages available. So this requires data sets for each language, and so it is a significant resource. With transnational platforms like Amazon, Apple and Google dominating this market, the decisions about which languages are supported in voice search technologies is driven by economic rather than social or cultural needs. For example, in March 2020, Alexa supported 8 languages. We could do a quiz on which ones, but I shall whiz through them. So English, French, German, Hindi, Italian, Japanese, Brazilian Portuguese and Spanish. Probably no surprises there. Plus 10 dialects of English, Spanish and French. Siri supports 21 languages. Google is a little bit better. It has 44. In the context of discoverability, what this means is that certain program titles will not be recognised at all in voice search because the language is not supported, placing further barriers for content from smaller markets and minority languages. So to sum up, what I hope to have impressed upon you today is the value of looking at TV apps, a form of media paratext that is really easy to overlook because it's increasingly just part of our everyday TV viewing experience, what Jeremy Morris refers to as mundane software. Looking at TV apps is really helpful in opening up some of the new dynamics of the TV marketplace, in which how people discover content is increasingly subject to commercial. In this sense, the function of TV apps as entryway paratext is not economically neutral, but is subject to financial transactions in which international players have a distinct advantage. Put bluntly, if TV apps function as entryway paratexts that determine and control entrance to a text, it is a paratextual function that is shaped by financial negotiations between content apps, aggregator apps and device manufacturers, in which major transnational players have the upper hand. So as apps continue to become more important and common as a way of accessing TV, we need to pay attention to these commercial dynamics and the ways in which they're shaping our TV experience. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Kathryn. Very, very informative. I have to say I'm especially interested in the localization aspect of apps that we use because they're so, they go across national borders, of course. So I think it would be especially interested for us students, that aspect of localization. Yeah. Okay, so we'll keep questions for the end, and I'll go ahead and introduce our next speaker, Kathryn Batchelor from University College London. So as I was saying earlier, Kathryn focuses mainly on literary studies and translation studies. So translation theory, literary translation, translation history, philosophical translation, very interesting. Translation in power, translation involving Africa. So I won't go over all of her publications, but I'll mention, of course, her book from 2018, Translation and Paratexts, which is particularly relevant for this event today, which is not only about media paratexts. So if you're interested in paratexts, that's a very good review of what they are, and it contains a lot of interesting case studies. So specifically today, Kathryn is going to talk about paratexts in audiovisual translation research. Thank you, Kathryn.
Thank you very much, Chiara. So yes, thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here virtually. When I told my kids I was speaking at the University of Bologna today, they said, "Oh, are you going to Italy?" So I think the reality hasn't quite, fully sunk into them. So they were a bit disappointed that I was just going into my office at home. But it's lovely to be here virtually. It's fun to be reunited with my former colleagues from the University of Nottingham. And to be on a panel event that's bringing together these two disciplines of media studies or cultural studies and translation studies. So I'm very pleased to be the middle part of a media studies sandwich, as it were. So I'm going to share some slides, actually. Let me see if I can get this to work. Hang on, I just need to move you all over here, get you out of the way. And then I can share screen 1. So can you just tell me if you can see my presentation?
Yes,
very clearly.
Okay. So I want to talk about the contrast between the amount of scholarship on media paratexts in media studies and the amount in audiovisual translation research. That's going to be the main focus of my talk. If I have time, I can talk about definitions of the concept of paratext, but I have to say, Chiara, I kind of left that one to one side because I thought 15 minutes is not very long, but we can talk about that later if we want. So the concept of the paratext has been extremely productive in media studies, particularly in respect to research into digital literature, transmedia storytelling, obviously film, television, video games. And this book that you can hopefully see by Jonathan Gray, Show Sold Separately, was published in 2010. It wasn't the first to apply the term paratext, which was originally developed in French literary theory. It wasn't the first to apply that term to audiovisual material, but it was particularly influential, I think it's fair to say. And there have been quite a number of books published since then that look at paratexts, and also huge numbers of articles and book chapters. And of course, Paul and Kathy, my fellow panelists, have published extensively in this area. So in translation studies, in contrast, most people who've been interested in the paratext have been interested in literary texts, and take-up of the term paratext in the field of AVT has been a lot more muted. So there have been a number of important articles by Chiara, the organizer of this session, and some other article-length case studies, but really very little. I had a quick look at the Routledge Handbook of Audiovisual Translation that came out in 2018, and just 2 of the 32 chapters in that mention the term paratext at all, and they do that only very, very briefly. So the contrast there between media studies and translation studies, I think, gives rise to the question, do we need the paratext in audiovisual translation research? And I think we can address that question from 2 angles. So the first thing to try and establish is whether the absence of the term in AVT equates to an absence of interest in what have elsewhere been called paratextual phenomena. And then secondly, to try and look at how looking at these paratextual phenomena can enrich AVT research, and also whether we really need the term paratext in order to benefit from it. Okay, so there's kind of various questions rolled into that one question. So the first angle is, does the absence of the term paratext equate to a lack of interest in paratextual phenomena, or are these being studied under different names? The second one is, how can the paratext enrich research, and do we need that term? The answer to the first question is yes and no, no and yes. So I did a very crude cross-referencing of Jonathan Gray's indicative list of on and offline media paratextual materials from 2010, which is here. So things like ads, trailers, marketing campaigns, fan creations, and so on. So I did a quick cross-referencing of that list with the index in the Routledge Handbook of Audiovisual Translation. And that suggested to me that research in AVT remains overwhelmingly focused on subtitling or dubbing practices for films and television programs themselves, rather than looking at the activities and elements which surround those core products and which might be labelled paratextual. On the other hand, the absence is not complete, so there's some important work by Luis Perez Gonzalez at University of Manchester, particularly in his work on amateur subtitling. He looks at things that could well be called paratext, so things like headnotes that are provided in addition to subtitles giving background information. He looks at questions of hypertextuality, at the websites used by fan subbing communities and the community building functions of those. And he also looks at what he calls spectacularization, where you have font and color variation. Now, all of those could easily be labeled paratexts. Similarly, the work by Tessa Dwyer on, again, fan subbing actually quotes a reasonable length from a book by Jason Mittel in Media Studies, and quotes him talking about tie-in merchandising, video games, ARGs, and so on, but doesn't cite his word paratext. So he actually justifies the use of the term paratext and the usefulness of it to bring all these things together, but she leaves that bit out. So to some extent, people are looking at these things that might be called paratexts, but it's a fairly minor area within AVT. So second question is, can we, if we get more interested in this stuff, will that enrich AVT research? And my view is yes, absolutely. Jonathan Gray originally put for looking at these things in media studies, and it remains convincing and I think just as relevant to studying translated products as non-translated ones. So he writes, given their extended presence, any filmic or televisual text and its cultural impact, value and meaning can't be adequately analysed without taking into account the film or programme's many proliferations. And this is exactly the kind of thing that Kathy's just been talking about. Decisions on what to watch, what not to watch, and how to watch are often made while consuming hype, synergy, and promos, so that by the time we actually encounter the show itself, we have already begun to decode it and to preview its meanings and effects. So, and I think that holds true just as, well, even more today than it did in 2010. So I think there are particular ways in which looking more at these paratexts can enrich AVT research. For example, I think giving a bit more attention to them would allow us to give fuller accounts of audience perception. So if we look at the promotional and the ancillary materials as well as the actual products. They will allow us to pay greater attention to some questions that are quite big in translation studies around agency and power dynamics. So particularly, and again, Kathy was talking about all of this, the networks, you know, who's involved actually in importing audiovisual products? What are the power dynamics between the various groups and so on? And of course, paying greater attention to economic factors. And there has been call for a sort of economic turn within translation studies, and I think this could contribute to it again, as Kathy's talk very nicely showed, that you know, these, when we're looking at TV apps, for example, it's about economics, it's about leverage, it's about economic advantage, and so on. So we can bring those questions in more clearly. And then this is something else, just to mention another colleague from Nottingham, just to make this complete, as it were. My colleague Alex Mevel has just published a very interesting article about what he calls the accessible paratext. And his insight there is that while there is a proliferation of media paratexts, there are actually a lot of them that are not accessible to all audiences. And what he's been doing is working with Redder Theatre Company, a theatre company in Nottingham, that is putting on shows that incorporate signing and subtitles to make them fully accessible to deaf audiences, and to make the signing and the subtitles part of the production. So they're really creative. And they've actually produced some paratextual material that is in itself accessible and that highlights accessibility. I don't know if this is going to work. I'm fairly sure you won't be able to hear the sound, but let's just see if you can see at least a little bit from the clip. I'm just going to go into the middle of it so you can see. This is an advert, a paratextual advert for a show. Okay, so that was just to give you a little idea of the kind of accessible paratext that we can create. And I think projects like that really harness the potential for, they illustrate the potential for academic insights into the power and reach of paratext to actually be harnessed to bring about positive innovation in the creative industries. So they're very, I think, very important. But then to get to my kind of final question, do we need the term? So do we actually need this word paratext? Can we not just study all of that without it? Now, Jonathan Gray actually comes to this question in 2015 when he's giving an interview and an afterword to another book. And he addresses it directly, says, why bother with the word paratext at all? My answer here is a practical one. We need the word as a reminder, an insistence even, to look at paratexts. It is all too easy to fall back on a mode of scholarship that is centred and isolated on the work itself. This can be dangerous scholarship if it effaces and erases so much of a text's imprint on the world. And this was the original point made by Gérard Genette, who brought in the term and popularised the term paratext and devoted a whole book to looking at paratexts. He said, we've got to look at them, because they are doing important things. They're actually incredibly powerful. And Gray's making the same point. And I think if he's making the point that we still need the word paratext in media studies as a reminder, then we need it all the more in AVT, because we haven't really even started to engage with it very much. And Gray goes on to say that he hopes that the word paratext might become obsolete, that we'll have this habit of attending to them that will become ingrained and systematically included when we're researching, the work itself, as it were. So he says that within media studies, we're not yet at that point, and I would say we're certainly not at that point in AVT. And I think that one of the usefulnesses, that's not really a word, but the uses of paratext as a word is it brings together, it's a kind of umbrella concept that brings together a whole load of smaller things, and therefore kind of gives each one of those a place in scholarship, whereas you wouldn't necessarily devote a whole book to TV apps, but you would probably devote an article to that and incorporate it into a wider study. So the umbrella term, I think, is useful. But also I think one of the main uses at this point in time is that it brings disciplines together, precisely as we're doing today. So there's a really rich body of research in media studies, and in translation studies, we've got a huge amount to learn from that. And also we can bring things to media studies by looking precisely at how paratexts, go across the world, the globalization, the localization of paratexts, and so on. And another advantage here is that the media studies scholars have done a lot of the hard work of working out how to make Genette's term in literary studies actually work in media studies. So we can, in a way, sit back and relax a little bit. Okay, that's all I've got to say. I just need to work out now how to stop sharing my screen, which I am now unable to work out. Oh, there we go. There's the button. Brilliant. So that was it. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Kathryn. Very, very interesting. I think especially for our students in the audience here. Yeah, and I mean, I can confirm that the fact that even my own personal interest in paratext from the point of view of translation comes from that we usually don't consider, when we train our students in audiovisual translation, we tell them, okay, there are some TV series to be translated, subtitled, dubbed, some films, etc. But or even you know, video games, that's another popular one, but we tend to overlook everything else, and it's important to know that that's material that it's there and needs to be translated, mediated, localized somehow. So that's a really some interesting things to think about in that respect. So I have a lot of questions, but I mean, I'll keep my comments for the end, or prioritize questions from the audience. Okay, so thank you very much. And I think we can introduce our last speaker for today, Paul Grainge. Here he is. Hi. Hello. So Paul Grainge is Professor of Film and Television Studies at the University of Nottingham, and he has published a number of books, of course. I think we've already mentioned some of those from the previous talks. He's co-author of Promotional Screen Industries with Kathryn Johnson, which is also available in Italian if you're interested. That was in 2015. He's editor of Ephemeral Media, Transitory Screen Culture from Television to YouTube, and of course a number of other articles and books in the field of media studies. So the title of his talk today is Paratexts as Social Media Entertainment. So over to you, Paul.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Ciao, everyone. It's really good to be here. I'm genuinely excited to be part of today's discussion about Media Paratexts, because I came to Bologna a few years ago for a conference on the subject of ephemeral media that was held at the Salon Marascotti. I'm not sure if you know that, but it was a beautiful building. And it was a really beautiful few days of sharing ideas about Media Paratexts, when this field of study was really just taking shape, and it included speakers from all over Europe and America. Jonathan Gray flew over when his own book on Media Paratexts, which you've seen the cover of, Show Sold Separately, it was still quite new at this point. So the conference was in 2013, and I remember the venue being really full every day. It was a 3-day conference, but every day it would always include 2 80-year-old nonnas that would sit at the back knitting and listening to the radio the whole time. And I think what was happening there, that they were coming for the amazing lunch rather than my insights about Media Paratexts. But I just want to say, if you feel the need to knit, do any craft project in the next 15 minutes, that's fine with me. And it's an invitation to Kathy Johnson, because she loves knitting. So if you do hear the sound of knitting needles, it could be her. Okay, so I'm really excited by the theme today for 2 main reasons. Firstly, I think the discussion of Media Paratexts has moved on significantly since 2013. At the previous conference, a lot of the discussion was really about clearing space for analysing media texts that were not films or TV programmes, but were the short forms that surround those primary texts. So the trailers, the title sequences, promos, web videos, and so on. Now, Kathy and I published a book in 2015 which examined the blurring boundaries of promotion and content in contemporary screen culture. And part of our argument was that shifts in the digital media environment have unsettled the distinctions and the hierarchies between what is deemed to be primary screen media and what is seen as secondary paratextual content. Now, I would argue that the blurring of these boundaries has intensified in the last 6 years with the rise of social media entertainment. So that's something I'm going to talk about briefly today. Now, the second reason why I'm really excited by today's discussion is the invitation to think about the issue of translation. It's been really good for me just to think about how that applies to this field. I haven't really, kind of applied that lens before. And I think the subject of translation lends itself really well to the study of media paratexts, as there are many different ways we can understand the nature of translation. We can, of course, think about the translation of media between different cultural and language contexts and how paratext might function in this process. But we can also think about the translation of media across media platforms. So the way that content made for broadcast television, for example, is translated for distribution on YouTube as well. So I'm going to think about that a little bit as well. So let me start just by defining social media entertainment, as this is a really useful and important, I think, concept for the study of media paratexts in our current moment. Now, the term isn't mine. It's been coined by Stuart Cunningham and David Craig in an influential book that they published last year called Social Media Entertainment. Now, their book is about what they call a new screen ecology that has been driven since roughly 2006 by interactive platforms like YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and also Chinese equivalents like Youku, Weibo, and WeChat. Now, central to the new screen ecology is what Cunningham and Craig call a proto-industry of content creators that have developed new entertainment and communicative formats. And these include vlogging, gameplay, and do-it-yourself videos, which have really given rise to a whole host of social media celebrities and influencers that specialize in all kinds of different areas, from fashion and travel to lifestyle and design. Now, I'm pretty sure that you are all familiar with aspects of this culture. So I've got two children, two boys, they're aged 11 and 15. Most of their screen life is with this world, not television, but YouTube. And they've educated me on some of the stars of this world, whether it be David Dobrik or Mr. Beast. Now, this world is what Cunningham and Craig call social media entertainment. And they suggest that it operates with a different logic and business model to traditional entertainment industries. So vlogging is really a key format in this space, and it involves social media creators building a community of followers and talking and interacting with them in quite intimate ways across multiple platforms. Okay, so how does this context relate to media paratexts and to issues of translation? Well, I think that social media entertainment has presented challenges and opportunities for traditional media industries as they've sought to navigate and bridge to this platform world. In the context of television, it's really accelerated the blurred lines of promotion and content, and with it the distinction between what is a TV paratext and what is social media entertainment. Now, let me give you an example that might help think through the point that I'm trying to make. And it involves a YouTube phenomenon that has developed over the last 5 years that you may be aware of, although possibly not. And I think that would raise its own questions about the circulation and translation of content on YouTube. The case I want to mention is Carpool Karaoke. Now, if you haven't seen or heard of this, it really doesn't matter. But if you've got a teenager in your family, they may have heard of it because the whole format was licensed and adapted for Italian television in 2017, and it was broadcast on Italia Uno and hosted by the Italian rapper Jake La Furia. So Carpool Karaoke, it's a 10-minute segment of an American late-night talk show called The Late Late Show with James Corden, which is broadcast on CBS in a post-midnight slot on American TV. Now, when this show was relaunched in 2015, the program makers deliberately sought to expand their viewership beyond the broadcast audience by translating segments of the show for distribution on YouTube. Now, translation in this context really refers to the way that segments of TV were unbundled and then reframed in ways that made it seem that they were made for YouTube. So really, Carpool Karaoke is the most successful incarnation of this tendency for talk shows to become generators of digital content in this way. Now, Carpool Karaoke, it uses the setup of the host, who is James Corden, being late for work and needing a passenger to use the carpool lane in Los Angeles. It's filmed inside a big black Range Rover, and the passengers are revealed to be major music stars. And these have included Justin Bieber, Adele, Rod Stewart, Stevie Wonder, Lady Gaga, Madonna, Paul McCartney, and so on. Now, the segment is based on Corden and his passengers singing karaoke versions of the stars' favourite hits as they drive and talk and, you know, kind of commute around Los Angeles mostly, but also it's been filmed in other cities. It's been filmed in Las Vegas, in Liverpool and New York. Now, in design, I think the segment really does tune in to the popularity of music performance on YouTube, on TikTok and other social networking services. And as a result of Carpool Karaoke's success online, the Late Late Show's YouTube channel grew from 27,000 subscribers to 11.3 million a year and a half later, with 1.7 billion worldwide views on YouTube for Carpool Karaoke during that period. If I just take one of the drives, the drive he did with Adele is still the most watched of all Carpool Karaoke videos, and that amassed 42 million views within the first 5 days of it being posted. And by comparison, this dwarfed the broadcast audience for the Late Late Show, which was averaging about 1 million viewers for its 2015 season. Now, one question to ask is whether a short form like Carpool Karaoke is in fact a media paratext. In one sense, Carpool Karaoke serves a key paratextual function as it became marketing material for audiences who missed the broadcast of the Late Late Show or perhaps chose not to watch it. It was designed fundamentally to promote a late night TV franchise. However, Carpool Karaoke was also deliberately tailored for the YouTube environment to exist as content in its own right. And this complicates the status of Carpool Karaoke as a media paratext, for it was framed and distributed as a self-standing brand within this world of social media entertainment. Now, the popularity of Carpool Karaoke on YouTube led to a licensing deal with Apple TV to make Carpool Karaoke as a discrete on-demand series. And this accompanied separate deals for versions of Carpool Karaoke in TV markets with local hosts. And this included Carpool Karaoke Italia, but also Carpool Karaoke Arabia. Now, here the question not only becomes one of translating a paratext into a TV show, but also of adapting it to a specific cultural market. So in an episode of Carpool Karaoke Italia, for example, Jake LaFuria drives around the operatic pop trio Il Volo in a bright yellow city car. So rather than feature a big Range Rover, the Italian version is filmed in Rome in a Fiat 500 with members of Il Volo occasionally bursting from the vehicle to sing opera and football anthems in the street. Now, not all car cultures are the same, of course, so Carpool Karaoke Italia translated the format to fit the exuberant nature of driving and being in a car in Italy as compared with Los Angeles. Now, I could say much more about the relation of cars to the culture of vlogging, as there are interesting things to note, I think, about the way that digital content has been drawn to filming, talking, and performing inside vehicles. Cars are a really intimate space, and the availability of smartphones and GoPro cameras has made the car a really popular location for short mobile web videos. I think for today, the interesting issue is how Carpool Karaoke translated from Paratext to web content to both an on-demand series and an international TV format. Now, Kathy Johnston, she's written of the volatility of television in the internet era and the unstable definition of what television is as a medium. I would say that media paratexts are also unstable in their definition, as they are increasingly made to travel, traffic, and translate between TV and digital contexts. Now, James Corden said something really interesting about Carpool Karaoke after it was launched. When it became clear that the viewing figures for Carpool Karaoke substantially exceeded the ratings for the Late Late Show, Corden said this, and I'm quoting now. He said, "I genuinely couldn't tell you how many people watch our show because I feel like in this post-midnight slot, we're not really in the ratings business. We're just in the relevance business. My major ambition is just to stay relevant. That's it, to be in the conversation." Now, this statement, I think, really speaks to the growing realignment between television and digital media in the 2010s. And this includes the cross-pollination of media forms, but also the models and the metrics that support ways of doing business in the post-network era. So my question really to end on is, to what extent do media paratexts, the short promotional forms that surround entertainment franchises, become the way that relevance is established and maintained in a media world where my children really are more likely to grab and share short videos than they are likely to sit and watch traditional TV? In short, to what degree have paratexts become the main event? Grazie.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Paul. I hope you can still hear me. Okay, great. Thank you. It's really great to see how all these talks are very complementary. They complement each other very well. You all addressed different issues concerning paratexts, media paratexts. So it was really, really great, very interesting. So imagine us all virtually clapping here and cheering from our screens. I'm sure there are going to be questions. So I encourage our audience. Yes, a lot of clapping emojis in the chat for everyone. So I encourage our audience, our students even, if they want to ask questions. If not, I have a few, but let's start with them. And by the way, thank you, Paul, for reminding us of that great Media Mutations conference in Bologna. I was there too. And thank you.
I can tell you, Chiara, that actually Jonathan Gray, there's an acknowledgement in my book with Kathy, Promotional Screen Industries, for all the people that gave me food for thought for helping with that book. And that was a reference to the gnocchi that Jonathan Gray and I devoured during that whole conference. It was the thing that he took home to America with. All the chat about media paratexts were great, but the lunch at the Salon Mariscotti, that was the thing that brought him over.
That's true, and great location too. I think Luca's here, so thanks to him and his department for organizing that conference and all the conferences in that series as well. Okay, so does anyone have questions? Otherwise, I'll start.
If you want,
Luca.
If you want, since you have called me, hi to everyone. It's very nice to see you here. in this strange way. Actually, it would be great, better to meet directly, as we sometimes did in the past. But it was wonderful to listen to all the three presentations, which were very rich, very interesting, and also relevant to my interests, my field of research, and the fields of research that I share with Chiara and Delia and all the group in this other department of the same university. I will try to keep myself brief. I'm not sure I will be able to, but I have so many questions also for other times, but I will limit one question to each of you, so not to take so much time. And once again, thanks for all the three speeches that also connected very much, so we can also continue this kind of discussion, putting together the different perspectives and the different pieces and bringing further this kind of research. As for Kathryn Johnson, I would ask you something. Actually, your work on the television apps is very interesting and inspiring, and I would put that in relationship with the issue of complexity, of the complexity felt by users in accessing, by general mainstream users in accessing this digital television landscape, which is in a way, I feel that these apps are trying to reduce the complexity, a kind of internal complexity which is reduced. So maybe Netflix is also so popular not just for its content but also for the easiness of the app, but at the same time they are also increasing an external complexity in the way you need to address several apps and to put everything together with also the normal television and the YouTube and a lot of other stuffs. So this is my question is if you have thought about that and if you have some clues about the trends or the trajectories around this aspect. The second question to the other Kathryn, Batchelor. We do not know each other personally, but I hope it will be possible in the future, because once again it was a very interesting reflection and thoughts, and very much crossing the paths of a bit of research I've done on the Italian translation of some paratexts as well, the paratext around the Lost series a lot of years ago and stuff like that. And I would ask you about this issue of AVT paratext, if you would include in this kind of paratext also the industrial materials connected to the translation, adaptation, and dubbing. So if you think they can fit inside this field, or if these are different materials that must be addressed in different way. Of course, they are interconnecting. Sometimes we have some of these materials which are actually published and used in a promotional way, but I cannot fit them so well. So I ask you if you can help me about that. And last, thank you also to Paul for your presentation. I'm also very happy because actually you mentioned a book which is Social Media Entertainment, which we will be publishing in Italy in the same collection. So it's being translated right now, and it's great to know that we have done a good choice. I wanted to ask you about this online circulation. It kind of appears to me like a polarizing kind of thing. In some ways, we have probably a lot of niches which are able now to access directly the global content in its original version as per social media materials. And on the other side, we have a mainstream audience which probably is still very much keen to this kind of promotional materials declined in another language towards another culture and so on. And I would love to hear you if you have thought something about that, about this kind of friction. I have the feeling that it's becoming increasingly more relevant, kind of a first class kind of viewership and a second class kind of viewership, which has of course effects, and it relates also on the different time synchronization that you can have with this kind of paratext and social media materials and promotional videos and so on. So that's it. I've already spoken too much, but thank you very much again to all three of you.
Shall I go first? We do them in order.
Yes, sure, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Luca. Really interesting. Actually, I'm interested in all of the questions that you asked. So I'll try not to talk too much because there's lots that I could say about that complexity. In the article, the longer article, I draw on a really excellent article by David Hesman-Hauck and Ramon Lobato, where they talk about the complex device ecology that's emerged. So they have this lovely paragraph, which I'm not going to be able to quote verbatim, where they talk about how in a lot of households you have your smart TV, but you've also got your set-top box connected to it. I mean, for me, I've got my Amazon Fire TV stick, my Apple TV, my set-top box, my Freeview box, my DVD player. You know, you have all these different devices. You've even got a PlayStation, and there's so many different ways in, and there's this kind of quite complex device ecology that this the apps are kind of sitting in. So I argue that they sit in this device ecology that competes with this platform ecology in its a really kind of complex environment. And I've actually done some audience research last year and this year. It's quite qualitative, looking at how people navigate this, how people find stuff. But we got people to show us when we could go into their homes, just turn your telly and just habitually show us how you find TV. And we had quite a lot of participants, especially older women, who really who struggled. They were like, oh, I can't, hang on, which remote is it? I don't know. Oh, my husband normally does this. It was gendered, but that was the case. So there is definitely that complexity as a problem. I think aggregator apps are trying to solve that problem, but at the same time also trying to dominate that route. Yeah. So I think that would be the ambition. And I think that things like Sky in particular, organisations like Sky, because they're internet service providers, because they're already in our homes, because they're already there with their set-top boxes, I think that something like Sky Q has the potential to try to position itself as that one-stop shop, where you can just go to oh my gosh, it's so complicated, blah, blah, but if I go there, I can just find stuff, or I can go from there into Netflix, and that the sort of entry is made more simple for me. So I think that for me, I'm really interested in what's going on in that aggregation space, because of exactly that potential that they can make things easier for us. And in doing so, they can also perform this quite dominant gatekeeper function. So I hope that answers your question.
Thanks.
Yeah, so thanks, Luca. It's very nice to meet you. As for your question, I think it's always really tricky to answer questions of, well, does this count as paratext and does that count as paratext? And I always think, well, we can make our own definitions, and with every article that we write, we can say, this is how I'm defining paratext for the purpose of this article, if we want to. I mean, that's sort of an academic convention that's there precisely because hard and fast definitions of most things do not exist. So I think we could classify those industrial materials as paratext in the sense that they're serving as paratext for the people who are dealing with them and who are coming to, they're working on the film or whatever it is, using those, and those are some kind of guideline into their entrance and shaping how they how they actually view, and then of course how they go on to translate and so on. But then I think I think there would be a natural aversion in communities are sort of calling them paratexts without sort of explaining why you're doing it, because I think what paratexts have come to be are these public facing things in some way. Of course they don't always target the entire public, but they usually are in some way public facing, rather than, you know, being closer to what we might think of as kind of, you know, archival research and those kind of things. So I think it can certainly be done. It might not be obvious to people initially, but I think if you can define paratexts as sort of those that have narrow audiences versus those that have very large audiences, those materials would have a lot in common with other paratexts too.
Okay, Luca, many thanks for your question. I always marvel at your ability to pull together the most coherent questions at any kind of conference. So you've done it again in this virtual forum, so thanks for that. I'll be quite brief in my answer because I can see there's some really great questions coming in the chat as well. So I don't the space for those. So I'm going to just answer two questions, one Luca and actually one from Bandar on the chat, which is one about what can we think of as a social media paratext. So the question from Bandar, and I hope I'm saying your name correctly, is are hashtags and emojis and things like that social media paratext? And it's a good question, that actually, because I was thinking about that just in our own virtual format today with the level of semiotic emoji applause going on. I mean, is that a paratext within our own platform today? So, I mean, I think that is a good question. So, Luca, your question to me was about, I suppose, the concept of first class and second class viewerships and friction and polarization between there. I think my short answer is it's a great way of thinking about it, but a hard one to figure out if you're a media scholar, because who is the first and second class viewership in that formulation? Because I think that's what makes things so blurry at the moment. Carpool Karaoke, for example, you know, became a breakout YouTube phenomenon that then drove all kinds of deals by TV broadcasters to buy the Late Late Show to broadcast in, say, Germany or the UK. So there was quite a lot of blurring between the life of the broadcast talk show and the life of Carpool Karaoke. So I think the polarization could be there, and it could be very much there in terms of, you know, I suppose, communities of viewerships. And, you know, when James Corden is talking about the relevance industry, are we talking about the relevance for a certain community of online users as opposed to my 74-year-old dad who won't have any engagement with that kind of visual life? So I think it's a great question. I suppose by way of answering Bandar really quickly, there's a really great article actually by an American media scholar called Miles McNutt, it's a really good name, about the way that Carpool Karaoke was, in his words, re-ritualized for the YouTube environment. And he talks about the kinds of paratexts that Carpool Karaoke itself used, and that included things like online trailers and end tags. So at the end of Carpool Karaoke videos, there would be things posted on those videos that would drive audiences to other Carpool Karaoke videos. So I think that would be an example of a social media paratext within Carpool Karaoke. But I think you're quite right to invite us to think about things like emojis as potential part of the semiotics of paratext within our social media world. So thank you very much for the question.
Chiara, I think Chiara,
Yes.
thank you. Okay, yeah, you go. Okay, for the question, I couldn't see you for a minute.
No, I'm here.
Go.
Still
Go,
holding
go.
up for now.
Go.
Yes, thank you. I think we have a few questions in the chat. It says primarily for Kathryn, Batchelor, but open to all. It says, in your book, you define paratextuality as a function, yet we still seem to keep discussing paratexts as a specific set of materials or practices. Would a move away from these taxonomic tendencies aid in the spread of paratextuality into fields such as AVT? Good
okay,
question.
that's a great question. And I was looking at some of the other questions, Akkad and Chunli and Maria. Everybody seems to want to discuss definitions.
Yeah, exactly.
Which is kind of, oh dear, yes, okay, let's discuss definitions. So Yeah, I mean, the question of whether you go for a functional definition or one that is maybe used to be anyway in Jeanette's day a sort of a physical one, or at least kind of a typology of different practices, that kind of thing, is really tricky, because the functions are not, it's not like you can just say a paratext is doing X or Y. And like Paul was saying, I think, when does a paratext become a thing in its own right, as it were? When does Carpool Karaoke become the thing? When is it a paratext to a show? And of course that is going to vary from viewer to viewer, so that the function of it is completely different. So you kind of, you tie yourself in knots whichever way you try to go, and you can criticize either kind of definition. And I mean, Jeanette had this problem in his book originally, where he said, I'm using a functional definition. Well, he didn't quite say that, but that's basically what it comes down to in his book. And yet his entire book is a typology of physical practices, right? So it's like that contradiction is kind of there in his original formulation. And I think it's kind of inherent in the problem, that we all sense that paratext is useful. It is something that, but actually when you try and put any boundaries around what it is, it's really, really difficult. It's really difficult not to slip into context. It's really difficult to kind of say it's always this, because often it isn't always that. I mean, just to bring in philosophy for a minute, I mean, Wittgenstein's idea of how we can define things is quite useful. He says, how do you define a game? How do you define a game? That's like a really much easier thing than how do you define a paratext. But that's actually really hard as well. So he says, the way we do it is we say, this is an example of a game, and this and this and this are examples of games. And that, in a way, maybe that's got to be our answer for paratext as well. But it sounds like a cop-out, but actually I think that is quite a lot around how, as humans, we group things together, and we call things, we call something a game or a paratext. So I don't know if that's a good answer, but I'll let the other panelists come in.
I just want to say I can't see the chat. I don't know why. It says I'm not a member of it, so I just wanted to say I just can't see the questions. But I think I very much agree with Kathryn in relation to these definitional issues. For me, I think that the key thing is just think about context. So what is not only the context within which the object of study, whether that is a set of behaviours or practices or set of texts, is functioning, but also the context within which you, as an inquirer, an investigator, is approaching that. And I think that it's, as long as one is aware of one's own context and explicit about it, then in some ways I think that the paratext might be in one context a function, or might be considered through its functional qualities. In another context, the same paratext could be understood in different ways. And I think it's about thinking about the context of the object of study and the context within which you are studying that object of study, and being explicit about those things.
Okay, so there are a few questions for Kathryn Batchelor, again, on what paratexts are. I don't know if you will consider those questions answered from your previous answer.
Maybe I'll jump around. I consider them half answered. And there's one there about, can translations be considered paratexts to works? Now I'm actually going to write an article on that. It's due in March, so yes, they can. Okay. They certainly can, but they certainly can also not.
Okay. So let's see, a question for Kathryn Johnson. Is branding considered significant for discovery apps and aggregator apps? And is this diminished by the dominance of a few major apps and deals between apps and content providers? If manufacturers want to limit quote unquote nation by nation changes, how does this affect the way apps are created and potentially branded?
Wow, that's a fantastic question. Short answer, yes, hugely important. So if we think about what I was talking about in relation to the continued importance of certain national apps, then branding is absolutely crucial. So in the UK context at the moment, there's a lot of discussion going on about these issues and whether there need to be new policies and regulations. And one of the things that the device manufacturers and aggregator apps are saying is, well, you know, the BBC is such an important brand. We're never not going to put iPlayer right at the top and the front of our interfaces, so that app is always going to be prominent, of course. If you are, as I said, let's say the Welsh language public service broadcaster S4C, I've never seen S4C's app on my smart TV or my Amazon Fire TV stick. Now, it's not relevant to me, I'm not a Welsh language speaker, you could say. They do bilingual content also, and if you're in Wales, it's not going to become preloaded on your television sets, for example. So it doesn't have that brand recognition of the BBC. So I think branding is absolutely crucial in some of those kinds of negotiations, and that having a strong brand becomes really important. The other thing that I think your conversation is getting at is what happens to the brand of the originator of the content. Particularly I'm thinking about the sort of broadcasters rather than the studios, production companies, in that kind of aggregator environment. And that's also a really important issue. So it's both is content attributed? So when you search for, say, content in SkyQ, is it clearly attributed to the particular app that it sits within? And a second issue related to that would be, once you're in, say, Netflix, is the content clearly attributed to the original broadcaster for that content, which it is in some instances and it isn't in others. And again, that is subject to commercial negotiations and also to regulatory negotiations and some goodwill. So I think the question of branding is absolutely vital. And I think that apps that come from broadcasters with stronger brand histories and brand loyalties will have a better chance of being more visible and more accessible in this environment.
Okay, thank you, Kathryn. I think I was going through the questions from the chat. There's one for Paul, I think, from actually Anna Julia is one of our students, audiovisual translation students here. So I'll read the question. Speaking as a translation student, this talk gave me the opportunity to reflect on the evolution of the position of translators and how much the label can be truly stretched throughout different fields. Considering the rapid evolution of digital content, such as Carpool Karaoke, and the growing need for mediation localization teams to adapt these new forms of content, what are, in your opinion, the new challenges that media experts and translators need to tackle in terms of adapting and localizing such pieces of media? I hope you can still hear me.
Yeah, that's
okay. Okay.
Thanks, Chiara. That's great. I mean, Anna's got a little bit more, but I mean, I think she talks about how it's interesting to notice how the role of the translator, mediator, localizer has evolved and blossomed in these last few decades. I think it's just a brilliant question, Anna, to ask, and it's making me think through that really on the spot here. My way of answering that now would be to think about what I thought about in developing this talk, because the first thing I wanted to know actually is if Carpool Karaoke itself was known in Italy, watched in Italy. Can I assume that? And I've got some PhD students actually from Bologna, and they were saying, well, no, I've not really heard of it. I think it's on Italia Uno. And I assumed that the sort of global language of music stardom, so Madonna, Adele, would, do some of that cultural translating on YouTube, but maybe not. I think in answer to the specifics of your question, I think I would, I don't know, you probably have more answers than me, possibly coming from, in terms of being from a translation background. But the thing that makes me think about a way of answering that would be to refer back to this book called social media entertainment, because what that book does, and if it's going to be translated in Luca's series, that's great actually into Italian, they invite you to think about a whole world of not only content creators, so the people putting the stuff onto digital platforms, but a whole world of intermediaries, so the companies and agencies that in some ways broker the traffic of that content around platforms. I think your question is really addressed and really well addressed to the question, what are the intermediaries in the world of translation that are beginning to service the world of social media entertainment? Because there is I think one of the ways in which I think the specific challenges might come to bear there is that what Stuart Cunningham and David Craig say is that social media entertainment has a certain kind of address that's different to broadcast television. It's fundamentally based on a discourse of the authenticity or the perceived authenticity of the vlogger, say. So how do you translate and convey that important sense of authenticity and intimacy within social media entertainment forms? That could become quite an interesting space for media translation within the ecology of social media entertainment. I think that's how I'd start to think about an answer to your question, but a great question, Anna. Thank you for it.
Thank you. And the other thing about that, and I think all three of you have touched upon this in different ways, is also obviously what the absence of paratexts also tells us about how things are mediated, in the sense that not all paratexts are necessarily exported in a way or localized for different cultures and languages. So it goes back to you, Paul, and Kathryn too. So who basically decides who are the gatekeepers in that sense? Just think about the DVD extras, for example. They're not the same for all editions of the same DVD box sets, for example. And this is just a small one. So yeah, something else to think about.
Can I ask a selfish question? Because I'm writing an article on it, Carpool Karaoke. Am I right in thinking that Carpool Karaoke is not widely known within Italy?
Good question for the audience mainly. I wouldn't necessarily super popular, but might be wrong. Please chime in.
Surely we should be asking a younger cohort.
Yeah, exactly.
The students I see online are master student. My youngest is 20, but she's in a lesson in another room. Otherwise, I'd ask her. But I suspect that it is popular. We need to ask a younger cohort of an audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, my son, I've got a 15-year-old son, and I asked if, he lives with me here in Nottingham, and I said, have you heard of it? And he had, but only not because he was interested in Carpool Karaoke. It just popped up for him because he was interested in a particular band, and it's a recommendation algorithm on YouTube. If you like Red Hot Chili Peppers, it will recommend the Carpool Karaoke with Red Hot Chili Peppers. So I suppose
You're showing your age on that one. Sorry, Paul.
I know. I was trying to think of a band that my 15-year-old would like. He'd be horrified to think I was suggesting that he was into Red Hot Chili Peppers. Clearly not the case. I think he's into My Goss, some rap band anyway. But I suppose that goes back to Luca about first and second class viewerships, the status of viewerships, and how content arrives actually on your screens through algorithms, which really, I suppose, returns to a bit of the territory Kathy Johnson was introducing us to.
Well, one of the things that I was thinking about also in relation to the question that you were asked, Paul, about the sort of the role of translators and localizers is, I remember when I first encountered this phrase, it's like, oh, sounds really mundane, but it's the role of metadata and the need for metadata to function across multiple languages and to be translated. So metadata is the data that sits behind all of the content and enables it to be searchable. And you know, I worked for a number of years on a project that was creating an online catalogue of audiovisual kind of history, sort of history of television through audiovisual clips, and we supported I think initially it was like 13 different languages, 28 different partners. Just getting a metadata standard that operated across all of those different languages with, say, genre terms that everybody could agree on and would translate across all of those languages and meant the same thing and would take you to the right content, for example, is incredibly challenging. It was very eye-opening to me, probably not so eye-opening to the translation people in the room. And I think those questions those questions of data, then they sit behind the algorithms, and then there's how the algorithm is written, which can shape how that data is interpreted. So then there's all those sorts of slightly more technical issues that are really, really important in these conversations that we're having as well.
If I can jump in about the Carpool Karaoke issue, I will be more or less just anecdotal, so sorry about that. But I think the Italian version has been conceived just as a television show and especially as a branded entertainment form. So it didn't actually add any circulation except the one intended in the TV schedule and in the television platforms of Mediaset. So it's kind of taking the format but doing all the wrong stuff to the format, not exactly adapting the original idea, but just the television show inside it. And this is also complemented. I'm looking at the chat. Some of the students who are saying more or less the same thing. We have not heard about the Italian version. We have looked at the US one. The US one arrives just in clips. Sometimes it's even translated. There was, for instance, the longer episode with Paul McCartney at Liverpool, which is wonderful, with also the Italian subtitles circulated on some of the website of the Italian newspapers and so on. But it's that kind of, I do not know if first class or second class, because for the television business, there's no money in its circulation. And therefore, this is this very strange kind of access. So the people you are talking to are actually already accessing the global content without the need of the Italian edition or so on. So that's a big mess.
Okay, there's one more question. Thanks everyone for chiming in, by the way. There's one question, maybe we can take that as our last question. Is for Kathryn Batchelor. Again, something else on audiovisual translation. As I'm studying the practice of fan subbing in social media and the promotion of short subtitled clips, I'm trying to study paratextual features such as colors, logos, tags, etc. Are there other features that can be included in this example of new practice of fan subbing?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, there's probably a much larger list of things that you could include. I mean, if you work from some of the typologies that have been developed in media studies, there's quite a useful one. It was developed in video games that I think I put into my book that I copied. Acknowledged, obviously not plagiarized. So I think working down one of those typologies will help you see all sorts of things. I mean, the great thing about typologies is they help you pay attention to things that wouldn't necessarily occur to you. So, colors, yes, it might jump out to you, but there might be other things as well. Like, I don't know, from one of your articles, Chiara, about the actual TV channel on which something airs is a paratext, in the sense that it kind of tells you to expect a certain kind of product, right? So that doesn't necessarily apply to social media, but those kind of things, anything that is kind of to do with how it's made accessible, how people can get to it, anything really to do with how they come to it or what might influence their thinking about it. So it's a really big list. Obviously, without looking at your actual material, I can't help you generate it more than that. But I mean, have a look at the work. Have a look at my book if you like as well, because I try and summarise there, a decade's worth of scholarship in digital and media studies to save people from having to do that themselves. So yeah.
Yeah, absolutely, and certainly all the ways in which that help sort of reframe, repackage something for a target audience or a target that's also, in my opinion, that's all part of that. So yeah, very long list.
There's some interesting media studies work on interfaces as well that might be useful, that just tries to sort of theorize and think through that the sort of the frame of the interface as a kind of paratextual frame through which you're accessing content. And it's quite challenging because interfaces are increasingly personalized, so they're not text specific. It's not like the text is always in the same place or encountered with the same paratexts around it. But some of that interface work might help you to think through some of those issues as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you so much. I don't know if comments on
I love Paul's
comments.
Yeah, Il Volo, who I think they're quite considered, if I dare say so, quite cringy or cheesy, sorry, here in Italy, perhaps. So maybe we don't get the recommendations. Don't know.
I'm trying to stop getting the recommendations. My algorithm now is really confused about my taste, because on the one hand I'm looking at all this high quality TV drama, and then I'm got Il Volo in there as well now. So that's the nature of algorithms.
And recipes for gnocchi, I presume. And knitting patterns.
Paul's a good cook. Can I ask, have we got time for me to ask Paul a very quick question? Because I was so intrigued by James Corden saying that in terms of the Carpool Karaoke segment, we're not in the ratings business, or even in terms of the show overall, not in the ratings business, we're in the relevance business. And I was wondering about that, not so much because I think if you take the word business out of it, it's like relevance is more important than ratings. But in the relevance business, I'm thinking, what's the bottom line? The income that they get from YouTube is not massive, because YouTube basically has an income sharing model that is the same for everybody, which they carp on about quite a lot. But it means largely that they will get probably around 55% of the ad revenue. That's going to be a fair amount of revenue with the amount of hits that they're getting. But I don't know. I mean, I'm wondering about what's the business of being relevant in that context of American TV.
Yeah, it's a really great question, Kathy, and it just leaped out, that quote, because it has so many levels to it in terms of business models. I mean, it's certainly the case. There's hyperbole involved in that quote, because just in terms of the Late Show trying to compete with other late night shows in that spot, I think it was a way of marking out a bit of positioning. So it was rhetorical in some sense, but it's undoubtedly the case that the global success of Carpool Karaoke has driven things like product integration at a much higher level than they would have been able to achieve otherwise. So some of the traditional ways in which American commercial television makes revenue, so with sponsorships with big brands. So for example, they didn't even disclose how much money they earned, but they got a huge amount of money from McDonald's for doing a Carpool Karaoke with Selena Gomez that went into a McDonald's drive-through. So, I mean, the relevance that they get on social media and the 1.7 billion views is feeding back actually into income for that business that isn't ratings, but is other more traditional forms of revenue. But it's an interesting rhetorical move, isn't it?
Yeah, Paul, I don't know if you saw that, there's a comment from Anthony Mitzel Yeah, just pointing out the fact that unlike other talk shows, James Corden's talk show is not available as a full show. I mean, it's not aired. So those are the only clips that are shared. I mean, not the only ones, but those are only shared through social media, etc., or YouTube.
This is really helpful, actually. The reason I'm kind of doing is I mean, I know Chiara's done a great book on comedy and taboo comedy. I'm sort of just moving into this little space and doing something about television and cars and comedy. So actually, this is like research for me, just being able to talk to you guys about how it sort of lands actually within a certain media national context. So, you know, you assume the circulation of globally significant YouTube videos, but you're never sure actually if they translate. It sounds like they have done and do, but that's cut across generational lines and all other kinds of ways in which media consumption is complicated now, isn't it, in terms of borders?
Absolutely. Well, I think we answered most questions in the chat. So if you don't have comments, I think we can stop here. Well, I'd like to thank everybody for being here, for chiming in their questions. Our students and the speakers, thank you so much for accepting our invitation to be here. Very stimulating talks today. So thank you so much. Again, virtual clapping going on all around here. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
And thank you.
Thank you for inviting us.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd just like to remind our audience, if you're interested, I'll post the link to our next event, next and last, I should say, December 7th, which is also going to be very interesting lineup there. So don't leave right away. I'll just post it when this is done. So thank you again. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Ciao.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye. Bye-bye.
Bye.